So Rodney, thank you for joining us today.
It's nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
You and I have been having this ongoing dialogue about sort of digital transformation. And I think for being from the financial services industry, for banks, digital's been a wave over a while, but it really started to accelerate, call it in 2020, right? When all of our clients decided to really commit to going digital. Now we're in this phase where we've seen digitization happen, and now we're hitting generative AI and this concussive wave of change that's coming through. And everyone's like, we've got to change, we've got to adopt. So there's lots we can unpack here about what companies need to do to sort of rewire themselves. First, start off with the book and talk to a little bit about the themes that you and your co-authors kind of discovered about digital transformation, how companies need to rewire themselves for the future.
Super. And concussive wave is a great phrase, right? It certainly felt like that at times. Let me maybe start with, I'll tell you the story of actually where we came up with the title for the book, because I think that's a good way of sort of leading into your question. So we have a consumer banking CEO roundtable, and we were in a meeting with many of the leaders of a number of the big North American consumer banks in Miami a few years ago. And I was waxing lyrical about how AI was coming, it was going to change the world, generative AI was going to need to be even better, everybody should get ready for it. And one of the CEOs sort of put up his hand and said, you know what, my consumer app is the same as his consumer app, like pointing at one of the other leaders. My private wealth app is the same as her private wealth app, right? We now all have thousands of people doing digital and AI and so on that we didn't used to have, right? Is this actually helping any of us, right? Or are we all just like running faster to stand still? And you can imagine the minute he said that, everybody else piled in. It's like, yeah, this is expensive. We're seeing a return on it, and so on. So we said, hold on. The meeting got a little bit raucous. We said, hold on. Let us look at your data and come back to you. So there were 15 in that meeting. So we got the data from 15 of them, and then another 35 banks through a benchmarking service that we run called Finalta. And we looked at the 50 banks. And what we saw was, at a superficial level, his challenge was right? Everybody's apps, I'm sorry to say this, are largely the same, right? Maybe somebody has a better design, somebody has a feature a few months ahead of somebody else, but they all do largely the same thing with similar levels of performance. So you couldn't tell if anyone was winning based on their apps. But when you looked at who was actually making money and whose customers were happier and feeling better served, there you could see real differences. What we saw was about 25% of those banks you could clearly see were making money through digital and AI and had happier customers through digital and AI. The other 75%, that was either not the case or it was sort of mixed, you couldn't quite tell. So if you couldn't quite tell the difference based on the apps, but if you asked the simple question of how well does business and technology work together in your bank, that was the single most discriminating question, right? And places that really had business and tech working together in proper software product operating model made a huge difference. Another next most discriminating question, tech talent career ladders, right? Institutions that really had thought about how to make tech talent successful and grow within their firms and have them become co-equal with the business leaders, and were investing in training up business leaders on tech, they were also much more likely to be in that group that was making money. So we looked at this and we saw 6 things that I can click down on if you like in a moment, that was sort of ended up being the themes of the chapters of the book. And what we said, the way we got to Rewired was everybody's got a digital veneer at this point, right? And nobody got through 2020 without creating a actually pretty good digital veneer. But whether people were succeeding or not for their shareholders, for their employees, and for their customers was about whether they'd actually rewired under the hood, right? The veneer wasn't enough. You actually needed to go and rewire how you conducted your business. So that was sort of what the themes that we then further developed.
So thinking about data, did any of the data speak to the differences of their client bases? Because one of the things we see, what we initially saw when we first put out our new version of our digital app, is that you had this distribution of adoption. Obviously, younger clients were more apt to adopt versus older and more affluent. But then we started to see the shift where our clients actually who had more sophisticated financial lives actually liked the fact that we could pull things together for them. And it became a lot easier for them versus calling your personal banker or calling your financial advisor, et cetera. So it became a change. And being the father of 3 college-age children who will never go into a bank branch, I think if they went into one, they wouldn't know what to do.
Right.
I do wonder how much demographic change is going to change that. Also, just thinking about that next generation coming up into the workforce, or they were born with cell phones in their hands, and not just cell phones, but smartphones, and they're just more tech literate.
Yeah.
And even business school grads. And so when I went to business school, tech wasn't even a conversation.
Yeah.
Now at Harvard Business School as an example, they're just introducing mandatory first-year class in data science
Right.
for first-year MBAs. So it's a completely different, to your point of rewiring companies, you're trying
Yeah.
to start with a different generation coming in. But did the bankers in that retail forum have any insight into their different behaviors of their customers and how that may have impacted the profitability skew you?
So what we're seeing, maybe more broadly than just in that forum, what we're seeing is there are almost no non-digital customers these days, right? There are going to be differences between whether people are, using a web app or whether they're mobile, right? Mobile, of course, has been by far the fastest growing. And there are going to be differences in whether they ever set foot in the branch. And for some, it's important that they do every now and again set foot in the branch. But for many, like your kids, like my kids, they never will. And exactly how they like to consume their digital information and so on. But there are no non-digital customers, right? So this is here. This is for everybody. It's remarkable what the penetration has been at older age groups as well. And the demands are getting higher and higher, right? So now, it needs to be a seamless experience no matter, what entry route you have. Because everybody is using, a digital native somewhere in their lives, Amazon, Netflix, and so on. Their experiences are set by that, and then they expect that same level for all the ways they're interacting with sort of all of their needs. So I think banks have no choice, right, but to try and be as digital as the peak digital experience that all of your customers are having. And that age-based, there's still some demographic segmentation, and there are still some places that, unfortunately, digital inclusion is not fully reached. But for many customers, it's absolute table stakes. Which then actually gets to, sorry, I'm giving you long answers
this
here.
is great.
It then gets to, we firmly believe, your point about what Harvard Business School is doing now is interesting. We used to talk about there are business leaders and there are technology leaders, right? That's not the case anymore, right? Or at least it won't be the case. So certainly 10 years from now, and maybe much sooner, a business leader and a technology leader is going to be one thing, right? You'll still have technology experts, but anyone who's a business leader, right, needs to be savvy and fluent in technology and how to get value from it. There's just no question that that's happening across all industries, and banking should be a leader in that.
So when I think about how bankers are grown or developed over decades in their career, right? It's an apprenticeship model generally. And in the relationship side of the business, it's you start out as an analyst, you're doing these jobs over and over again for 90 hours a week, and then we sort of grow you to advising clients over time. In the consumer space, you become a product expert. You start out with understanding how a checking account works and all the regulations around it, and maybe you have an understanding that this is your tech partner who runs the tech stack who does that, and then you grow up the chain to take bigger, more complex product structures so you're running a line of business. What you're saying completely changes that dynamic. Like the leader who's going to be running a consumer bank of the future has to have an equal understanding of the business side and the regulatory side, but also the tech architecture, not only of what is today and is the future. So how do companies like banks, you say banks should be leaders, and I would say banks generally don't lead in very much. Right. Like we lag. Right. Because it's a highly regulated industry, also because there's a lot of inertia and other reasons. But what should we start thinking about? What do companies like banks, what should we start thinking about in terms of how we start moving our companies forward to be these more agile, nimble, digital-focused, customer-focused organizations?
So we have a survey tool we use, we call Digital Quotient and AI Quotient, and we look across all industries. And we see sort of how digital and AI ready different companies are. And when we look at that, right, what we used to see is industries were pretty much arrayed like as you'd expect, right? High tech is the most digitized. Public sector is the least digitized. Banking is somewhere, better than the middle, right? Maybe sort of somewhere in the top third. So I think banks who really want to do well with their customers, right, actually have an opportunity to say, look, we can actually break out from our industry history and track record, right, and really sort of lean into this and get ahead of the pack. We also have evidence in that data that companies that get ahead then are able to stay ahead, right? People talk about digital transformation. The reality is it's a journey. And once you've sort of moved down that curve, that experience curve, you can then sort of stay ahead. That's all theory, right? What does it mean in practice, right? So, look, it will probably still be the case in many institutions that business leader will have a technology counterpart, right? Some places, like a digital native, like an Amazon, they talk about a single-threaded leader, right? Yes. You need one person who can do both. That will happen maybe someday, right? But in many cases, you'll still have a business and tech counterpart. how they work together is everything, right? So I was having this debate at a conference out west with enterprise CIOs, and I was talking about digital culture versus old-fashioned IT culture. And they were like, come on, this is just like consultant fluff, or is this just about like West Coast versus East Coast culture or something? And they challenged me, say, can you come up with in one paragraph what's really the difference between a digital culture and an IT culture? And we actually got it down to one word, right? And that one word is requirements. So companies that were talking, where business leaders were talking about requirements, right? They'd come up with what they need, they'd write a requirements document, they'd ship it over to the tech leader. The tech leader would then deliver against that, either him or herself or with a third party or something. That's the old model, right? Too slow, always will miss the mark. There's not enough ownership by the business leader. You just can't specify the requirements up front and then sort of outsource the delivery of it.
Yep.
The digital model is those two would co-own a problem, right? And would iterate towards different solutions to that problem, right? Product operating model, software operating model, agile, different terms for the same kind of flavor of thing. But that idea of a business leader and a tech leader who can co-own a problem and iterate around it is completely different from a, set the requirements, IT delivers against it. And it needs a business leader who really understands technology to be able to pull that off.
But implicit in that whole premise, which I completely understand and agree with, would be that the technology leaders also have to understand the business.
Yeah.
Because part of my experience is a lot of times you get people who understand the technology and how the stack works, but if you ask them anything about the business itself, they're like, I don't know. You tell me because they're so used to being handed a set of requirements that they code to.
Yeah.
So in a company where all banks have large learning and development organizations, and we run all kinds of training classes. Like, what's the best practice to actually start to bring those two together? Because there's generally, I don't think you need new people. You just need to retread the ones we have. So how do we do that?
Yeah, so totally agree with the thrust of the question. First of all, the point about retraining versus bringing in new people, it's critical. One of the things we found in the book was companies that went out and hired all the cool kids from Silicon Valley, right? It's a good way to change the company dress code. It's not actually a great way to sort of drive sustained impact.
I like the change in dress code. It's actually been very helpful. In a day like today, it's very helpful.
I should have done that today. It's a hard day, but yes. So you can bring in some new people, and you will need to, of course, right? But it is about actually how you upskill. And the upskilling certainly has a how you educate the business leaders. But like having technology people who are curious in and who understand the business, having the cross sort of rotations back and forth. And we've been really amazed by what some industries have done. There's one we talk about in the book, Freeport-McMoRan. It's a copper mining company, right? And in Baghdad, Arizona, right? I mean, talk about, when banks say they have trouble getting top tech talent, right? Try getting into like a copper mine in the Arizona deserts, right? And so they took their mining engineers, right? And they have an amazing group of mining engineers, right? Who they were able to build a super successful digital twin of their operations with by training them up and upskilling them. And we see this actually time and time again. There's another, I'll talk about industries that are easier to understand than banking. So there's a steel CEO who we work with quite a bit, and he likes to say it's easier to teach a metallurgist how to be a data scientist than it is to teach a data scientist how to be a metallurgist. So having people who understand the basics of the business, and in particular now these tools have got so much easier to deploy than they were, right? Just a little bit of education of a business person could go a long way in applying the tech. And similarly, making sure you've got tech people who are curious with and have incentives aligned with the business makes a huge difference.
So we've identified a theme where we need to have the business and tech leaders working together in a different manner, and we need to upskill both to sort of understand the other perspective and change that dynamic. What's next? What's the next, if you think about these themes, what's the next one?
So there's two things in there. One is on talent, on training them up, and then the next is on operating model and sort of how they work together, right? I would say those are themes 2 and 3, right? Okay. And theme 1 is top-down roadmap, right? And I'll use generative AI to illustrate this, right? So we spent some time earlier this year talking to companies to try to understand who really has generative AI impact in their P&L in 2024, right? So not in their strat plan, right? But actual real economic impact from it this year. And we asked across a whole bunch of industries, and this was around April, May time. And what we saw was maybe 10% of companies had real P&L value. And I'm sure that's a skewed sample, it's based on people we're talking to. And if you looked at who had value and who didn't, the answer was all in how they focused. So everybody sort of discovered Gen AI around the same time, right? Sort of January 2023. Everybody, started the CEO-led task force. Everybody asked the organization, give us all your use case ideas. The companies that were making money in 2024, they all around June, July of 23 stopped and said, look, this could have value in tons of places. Let's pick a spot, right? And I can come back and tell you what some of those spots were, but let's pick a spot. Let's pick a domain of the business, and let's think about how do we transform that domain. And instead of doing everything everywhere all at once, it's let's set a real financial target. Let's be quite top down about where we're going to do this. Let's build something great there, and then let's scale that and reuse those technology components and take it elsewhere. That's the success formula. And that was true before Gen AI came along. It's even more true with Gen AI because it's so deceptively easy to pilot. It's easy to drive yourself crazy with sort of everything everywhere all at once.
Everything you said sort of resonates with me at my soul because I sit on most of these councils and sort of have to sort of sort through the hundreds of use cases.
And they're all cool, right?
And
they all work at
interesting,
small
but-
scale.
Yes, and we're trying to aggregate them up. So part of what we've been working through is defining those domains. And there's a couple ways at least worth thinking about it. So one is you can think about, I'll call them horizontal things. So across all of our consumer clients, how do you leverage or where do you leverage generative AI and all the touch points? There's everything from supporting call center agents and sort of making that interaction better to Fargo, our AI-powered digital assistant, going directly to clients, to what you do to support bankers in branches and sort of bringing it all together and having one kind of view the customers, those kind of things. And then there's just actually taking a part of the business and saying, hey, we're going to take the wealth management business and we're going to see how we can completely disrupt and upend ourselves because we're going to think about it's about providing advice. Well, if you have the right data and the right model, the right interaction tool, you could, it's not like people are actually picking individual stocks anymore. So it's a different game. So, but what's the best practice of sort of thinking about how you define a domain so you can drive focus?
I think the criteria are it needs to be a big enough piece of the business to matter, right? Normally we say you want somewhere where it's 5 to 10% of the business and where you can see in that a tech-enabled line of sight to a 15 to 20% EBITDA improvement, right? If you aim for that 15 to 20% improvement, your chance of hitting at least 80% of that goal is much higher than if you're aiming for 2 or 3% improvement or if you put no goal on it at all, right? So somewhere, big enough to matter, right, is the first thing. And then, I think if you take any institution and you say, let's break it up into 10 areas and so on, there'll be 3 that are great, 3 that are maybes, and 3 that are probably nots, right? And in choosing between the great ones, pick the one where you've got the most engaged business leader, right? And where you're really going to have a business leader who is going to own this, view it as their initiative, not just the technology initiative, and then will be an amazing champion for sort of rolling it out further. Now, that's not to say then that you let the business leader sort of call all the shots, right? Because there's huge value in reusable technology in this, right? It's amazing how much, something you'll build for customer care will have value in, compliance. So, making sure you're building pieces with reusability in mind becomes then incredibly important. But you can do that no matter where you start.
And for the companies you've been working with, one of the things we've been thinking through are to the point about reusable technology, things that we disaggregate in a couple pieces. There are the models themselves, so the large language models that power a lot of this stuff. Those seem to be gravitating to a place where you've got a few very large players who are investing incredible amounts of money to train and build those models.
That's right.
Right, and then you have a few off that. You'll have certain, I'll call it smaller, specialized use case models that are equally trained. But part of what we're thinking through is partnerships in the ecosystem. And so, how much of this should we build in house?
Yeah.
How much should we think about, obviously sourcing through a partner, and which pieces? So, and for an example, so when we launched Fargo, we partnered with Google because there was no value in us creating, voice to text or text to voice translation. Like Google does that as well as anyone, if not better than anyone. What we needed to do is have an environment on our side so that we could train the core model to understand financial language, what our products are called, how things work, and so it sort of could understand and learn. So we built an environment on our side to do that. But what other companies done thinking about how they totally build things house? The basic stuff around having it in the cloud is easier aside. Like, what is there a rule of thumb or a
no, it's a hard question, right? So we tend to talk about thinking about where you want to be a taker versus a shaper versus a maker, right? So if we start with a maker, like creating your own models and so on,
Yep.
you don't need to do that, right? I mean, there are hundreds out there. There are 6 or 8 that all perform extremely similarly. There's important choices there. Like, do you want to run it? Do you want to send your data to the cloud to run somebody else's model, or do you want to take somebody else's model into your data environment, right? Those are real choices. So then it's whether you want to be a shaper, meaning you're assembling it from pre-existing components, versus a taker, right? There's a perfectly good software industry that serves all of you. Let them develop that and, go license it when it's ready. But in areas where you're looking for competitive advantage, right? Often something that is around the customer, maybe around supply chain, maybe around a core process like underwriting or something. There you'll want to build your own, but not build your own, meaning your own model, but assemble it from components, right? That's the shaper.
Yep.
We would be careful there in following a fully outsourced approach, right? Because we think this is a capability all companies are going to need to own. And in addition to that, the successful approaches seem to be around orchestration between many different models. And the hard part, the model itself, when we help companies build these enterprise applications, maybe 15% or less of the total cost is in the model. 85% is in how you do the context engineering around building up your data, how you do the right sort of reinforcement learning and testing of what comes out the other end. Those are things you need to build and own and capabilities you need to have for yourselves. So I think partnering for the model, maybe partnering to jumpstart on some expertise, but organizations of scale, you need to be able to do this as a capability.
Okay, so we've touched on, I think you called it themes 2 and 3. So we talked about people and operating model. And we've talked a little bit about architecture and some choices of how to interact with the ecosystem. And then I think we've also talked a little bit about, I'll call it focus, domains. What other, sage advice could you give us about digital transformation, particularly, again, as we get back to this?
I can say buy the book.
I do have the book. I've read the book, and I've watched a bunch of your YouTube, and we've obviously had a bunch of conversations about it. But what's next?
Yeah, so we talked about a top-down business-led roadmap, right? We talked about talent, we talked about the operating model evolution, and we talked a bit about technology choices. 5th is data, and then 6th is adoption and scaling. So let me take those one at a time.
Okay.
So on data, this is the hard part, right, for anyone who's trying to scale. And what we saw in the companies who were in that group that were more successful in making money is in data, they were doing 2 things, right? First of all, they were really investing in data governance. And I know that's sort of a boring topic, right? Or a dry topic, I should say. And it's frankly more of an organization problem than it is a technology problem. But it's critically important, right? And most companies think they're like one cool AI use case away from success. You never are, right? It takes dozens of different AI use cases in a domain to get real impact. And the way you can launch dozens of use cases cost effectively is by really having that data governance and sort of the underlying data pipes, right, working really well, having the right clarity around how you're building digital trust, what the rules are, and so on. And often doing that in a federated way. That's not a sort of a mandate for centralization, right, but for setting a common set of standards across the company. So that's thing 1 in data. Thing 2 in data is most companies actually overestimate the importance of their own proprietary data. And the reality is the companies who are in that winning quadrant, they're combining their own data with the world's data in really interesting ways, right? And figuring out how to be really good at using all the world's data, all the third-party data or public open source data that's out there, along with your own data, tends to be much more likely to be the winning formula. And the last one on there, adoption and scaling, you need clear and consistent role modeling from the top. You need to really think about, understanding the underlying mindsets and behaviors and so on. But much more pragmatically, a lot of this is about incentives, right? And too many of the incentives are put on the technology team and not enough on the business team, right? If somebody says, how's that personalization program going and so on, and everybody turns and looks at the CDIO or the head of AI or something, that's the wrong motion, right? They should be looking at the business leader who owns that program and has the same degree of incentive around it as the technology leader.
Focusing on where we are in our digital transformation journey and how we're thinking about adopting Gen AI, I get a little weary, but because if I go back to one of the core premises of the book, is that this is not a one-step change. This is basically a fundamental shift in how we operate, and it's going to be a constant evolution.
Yeah.
Just like we are as human beings, a constant evolution. So we have to sort of make that turn. When I think about focusing just on, the humans and the operating models, we're at a place where we are, we've set up like on digital, we have a digital factory, which is part of my team, right? So we've centralized everything for skills and knowledge and speed to market, but we're starting to think through the process of how do we start now embedding that skill set in the business.
Yep.
And as we pivot our digital experience to thinking about how we can use things like Fargo or other tools to be much more of a intuitive, intent-driven experience. That's going to sort of change how the tool set the middle, but the ideas and the stuff has to be embedded in the business.
Yeah.
Asking for a little free advice.
Right.
How do we accelerate that transformation? What are the 3 things I should think about doing in 2025 to sort of push that forward?
Yeah. So the step of like going from, okay, we've proven it in a digital factory and we've got this nice sort of sidecar that works, to really embedding it in the full business. I mean, that is the Rewire jump, right? And it's hard, right? So, how to do it. I mean,
So you make a living.
yes.
So
Yeah, but I say it's not knowing your organization, but it has to start with the business leaders, right? If the business leaders are not bought into this is actually mission critical for their business success, and therefore that they're going to develop their own sort of business-led roadmaps in each of the areas, then it's not going to happen, right? That's thing one. Thing two is the more fragmented your talent gets, right? The more you disperse it and so on, the more you need to be on top of the levers to make tech talent successful, right? So having a real tech talent career ladder, right? So they can learn and grow and so on. And then sort of the learning and training that we talked about earlier in the conversation, both for the tech people and for the business people. And then number 3, I think, would be really still holding the reins in pretty tightly so you don't get death by 1,000 pilots, right? Because, you can now imagine, right, you've suddenly created unlimited demand for some cool new digital thing around the organization. And, everybody fires that sort of all at once. And really grounding it in, where is the business impact? And frankly, making sure you have some strong enterprise architecture, right, to hold it together and make sure you are getting reusability and you're not getting, sort of random walks developed, right? That becomes important.
So Rodney, we started out talking about, digital transformation writ large. And then obviously in the last 18 months, generative AI is sort of taking over the hype curve and taking over so where do we think that's going? Where do you see it going?
Right. So, I mean, your hype curve comment's interesting because, like, is it overhyped? Of course it is, right? I mean, the technology industry is the best hype machine on the planet, right? We get that. But it is also, we think, the fourth platform revolution. Some people are saying the next industrial revolution. But the reason we're calling it the fourth platform revolution is we think this is as big as if computing was the first, internet was the second, mobile social cloud was the third. This is the fourth, right? So it's as big as those. But where are people using it? I mean, everywhere, right? But probably 90% of what we're seeing, and maybe almost all of what we're seeing that's driving business impact, is clustering in 4 areas, well, 4 C's. So the first is customer journeys, right? Everything around the call center, the website, so on. And initially, this was all around productivity. We're seeing more and more this is also around growth, right? When people are seeing how engaging some of these technologies are. Second, then, is around what we're calling concision, right? So concise plus precision. So how do you create virtual experts, right? So inside our firm, we've created one where, it's now sort of a virtual consultant that all of our teams can use that stops a lot of the hunting around different knowledge bases and looking for experts people used to do. We've seen everything from, mining companies using this for heavy equipment maintenance to banks using it for KYC or for policy documents and so on. The third C is then coding, right? The whole software engineering process. And, there's a good, like, my colleagues had the observation, like, the people who've benefited the most in the first year of generative AI have been the dogs of software engineers. And the reason for that is everybody's figured out a way to get their work done 20 minutes earlier and go home and walk the dog, right? And like, that's fine, that's nice, right? But for those of you who run giant engineering teams, you need to find a way of turning that into real business impact. And that's about not just giving people the tools and letting them figure out how to use it, but actually thinking about how do you fully change the software development process and life cycle in a way that sort of embeds this into a week in the life of a team rather than every developer using it in their own way. And then the fourth one is creative content, right? So all the cool personalization, image, video. We see amazing things on the cusp of happening with video avatars that we think are going to change many B2C and B2B interactions. But those four C's would be the big areas.
So I'm going to ask you one final question, and it's very focused on banking, just to give me a sense for where we are at Wells Fargo against some of our peers. When I think about we've lots of things going in labs and pilots, to your point, but for regulatory reasons and caution, and also just kind of making sure we're moving in the right direction and focusing on the right domains, we're taking a very deliberate pace.
Yeah.
From your perspective, from consulting to the industry writ large, where are we? Where's banking?
Yeah. So we did some research for a digital banking conference that we held in July of this year. And what we saw is 93% of banks have said something to their investors about not just AI, but about generative AI, right? 93%. You go through all the press releases and statements and so on, like 93%. But then if you say how many of them have put a number against that, right? A financial goal, it's 7%, right? So talk to, and maybe internally, maybe that 7 is 15 or something, right? But I think it's important to realize this is really early days, right? This is going to be an acceleration of the longer AI journey. But as some have said, we're a few steps into the marathon, right? This is not about, where can you be by the end of 2024? So look, we think all of those institutions do have the potential to get real business impact from it, right? We've written papers that talk about a north of 200 billion opportunity for the banking industry in Gen AI specifically, or a 15 to 20% or 15 to 25% improvement in absolute profit, or maybe 400 to 500 basis points improvement in a typical upper mid-sized bank if fully applied. We estimate, and maybe we're on the optimistic end, but you could capture maybe 60% of that within the next 3 years. And the rest will then be on a longer tail beyond that. So it's a huge opportunity. We're just getting started on it.
Okay. Rodney, thank you very much. It was great talking to you.
Thank you. Great talking to you too.